Hello, my name is Trudy Cole from the National Museum of the Royal Navy, and it's a pleasure today to welcome back four guest contributors that have produced interesting perspectives throughout Black History Month for the National Museum of the Royal Navy. And we're in conversation today to look at evidence and sources and what we can learn about Black history from the evidence. With me today, I've got Dr. Ray Costello, author and historian with a speciality in looking at British people of African descent. Martyn Downer, author and independent specialist in Nelson artefacts and art. Ellie Ikiebe, independent heritage interpreter. And Dr. Mary Wills, historian and honorary fellow of the Wilberforce Institute, which is part of the University of Hull. So I think, having looked at all your contributions over the month, I think the sources are obviously key to your work and our understanding of Black history and its connection with the National Museum of the Royal Navy and the story of the Royal Navy. I do wonder, what challenges have you faced in finding and interpreting sources? Are we ever really able to recover the voices of Black sailors? Ray, I wonder if I can come to you first for a thought around that.
Yeah, people talk about hidden histories, but then they're not actually hidden. They're simply hard to access, mostly through historic neglect and the history of the people, really. But I think that there are ways around it. It's sometimes a case of looking out, thinking outside the box and looking in unusual places. Now, I mean, the obvious thing would be, okay, it's going to be primary sources. It's going to be looked at, things that haven't been looked at before. Maybe in the National Archives in Kew or something like that. But that would be tremendously difficult to do, but it's a very big place, Kew. But what you need is leads in some way. And I found that the much scorned oral histories are actually a very good lead. Because when people tell you about that their ancestors happen to be Black, even if they're visibly white now, you can actually go back to that source and go to the primary sources and find out if this is true. A classic case of this, a lovely one, is a lovely woman named Ruth Crook, who lives in Grantham. Now, her ancestor, named John Simmons, was a Jamaican. And when I say West Indian, because you can have white West Indians, he was a Black West Indian as well, a Black Jamaican. Now, he was on the HMS Conqueror at the Battle of Waterloo at the time when Admiral Villeneuve of the French fleet, the enemy, surrendered. And it's an amazing story because so I know who he is through that family history. She has all the photographs, and of course there are no photographs in John Simmons' times, but she has a very nice painting of him as a Greenwich pensioner, taken in 1837. The green coat, as an older man, of course. And this is staggering. She's got all the photographs right down to the present. So I'm not at all sniffy about oral histories in any way, and we'll look at them. I've had really good material that way. And you find that, amazingly, even images can be found. Because, as I say, in the case of John Simmons, you think you're never going to get a Black sailor who might be of slave origin, although he might be a freeman as a seafarer, but you can find them. A classic case of that was I found, I expected not to be able to find a Black soldier at Waterloo, for instance. although I knew the names of the records and the race as well, in some cases. But what happened was a very eminent white officer had his portrait painted sometime after Waterloo, and he was known to have a favourite black bugler. And they took part in the famous charge of the 13 Dragoons at Waterloo. Famous. This guy was prominent. But he appears, when the family paid out some years after to have their father painted, this guy appears on the painting. So I actually have a painting of a black soldier, in this case, at Waterloo.
I think that's really interesting. I think, obviously that's an army story rather than a navy story. Yeah, yes. But in terms of filling in the gaps, I think it's really interesting. And just reflecting back on the contributions over the month, Mary, I was thinking around the crewmen and the fact that we've got diaries and accounts that were written by officers, but not written by the crewmen themselves. And actually, we need to look at, their position on the ship with what they said and the fact that they were discharged. And I wondered if how you feel about their voices and what we can infer from their voices. I think that idea of oral histories from family members is really interesting. And then how do we use that with the other evidence we've got? Mary, what's your feeling there?
Yeah, exactly that. I think from my own research, understanding the West African perspectives for the story of what I look at the Royal Navy and their role in suppressing the transatlantic slave trade in the 19th century. So we know that West African seamen were hugely important on the Royal Navy ships, that they were experts in navigation, and their local expertise was really key for how the Royal Navy were operating on the West African coast at this time. But exactly as you've said, there's very, very few testimonies written by West African people themselves. But what we do have is sources written predominantly by Europeans, but the sources that I've looked at, like you've said, are diaries and journals of British naval officers who served with West Africans on those ships. And they do give an insight into life on board and everyday experiences. We have material culture like Jim Freeman's testimonial, Scrimshaw, which shows how crewmen were valued members of the ship's crew. Naval officers wrote very highly of West African seamen in their diaries and journals. So it's just a case of gleaning what we can, while being very aware of the provenance, obviously, of those diaries and journals, but it's being able to glean what we can about those West African seamen from those diaries.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the really fascinating things about the Nelson letter, Martyn, is that this is not written by people of African descent. This is written by Nelson and then copied and used for an anti-abolitionist cause. And again, that's another perspective on the role of Black people in their relationship to the Royal Navy, or the Royal Navy's perception around slavery at the time. Just expand a little bit more about that and sort of the context that we've got and what we can infer about the lives of Black people, or the relationship between Black people and the Royal Navy at the time. Is that something that you could expand upon a little?
Thanks, Trudy. Yes, well, I'm particularly familiar with Nelson's correspondence over his life, of which there are, of course, voluminous quantities of letters surviving and being published. And I was just thinking, listening to Ray, how in those letters that Nelson wrote, and we know some 8,000 or 9,000, people of colour are often present but disguised and hidden to us, because they were often, of course, carried given names. And Nelson, in his correspondence, we know that many of his household and his retinue were people of colour or Black people, but they're hidden to us because they carried European names. And I just pondering on that and how much of Nelson's correspondence therefore disguises commentary, contemporary commentary on these issues. The letter you refer to is a letter that was written by Nelson in June 1805, when he was in the West Indies, having pursued the French fleet across the Atlantic in the campaign that would lead just a few months later, of course, to Trafalgar. Nelson had served in the West Indies in the 1770s and 1780s and was very familiar with the region, knew many people there, had married a daughter of a niece of a plantation owner, and he hadn't had a particularly comfortable career in the West Indies for all sorts of reasons, but he nevertheless was very familiar to it. The letter he wrote was to an infamous and notorious plantation owner in Jamaica called Simon Taylor. And in the letter, Nelson, who was particularly wary of criticism that the Royal Navy had somehow abandoned the West Indies by concentrating on the defence of Great Britain, was trying to reassure Taylor, who owned vast amounts of land and many thousands of slaves in Jamaica, that the Royal Navy was there to protect Jamaica. He was also seeking, on a personal level, he was seeking a favour for one of his members of his retinue in Victory, his chaplain, Alexander Scott, who was seeking a church living in Jamaica, and Simon Taylor had the power to give that. But in the letter, he makes some very candid comments about the slave trade, the abolition of the slave trade, and famously about his opinions of William Wilberforce. That letter, the original letter, is lost, assumed destroyed, but has often been cited, and of course, especially in recent months and in the last 2 or 3 years, is often cited as the key item of evidence of Nelson's personal opinions towards the abolition of the slave trade. The document that came to light 18 months ago out of a collection of historic papers is essentially a facsimile of that notorious letter, but is a fabricated document that was made following Nelson's death at Trafalgar and was made by the anti-abolitionist West Indian lobby in London for circulation amongst presumably members of Parliament ahead of the votes in the Houses of Parliament in 1807 to demonstrate Nelson's support for their cause in blocking and preventing the abolition of the slave trade. Because Nelson's original letter had been lost, it's very difficult, or was very difficult, to establish whether they changed the letter before it was then published by William Cobbett in 1807 in his Political Register. But during the summer, despite the current restrictions, I was able to access the British Library and to access the little inspected pressed copies of Nelson's correspondence, which are essentially his private carbon copies, if you like, in which there is the original letter. And it does establish that Nelson's words were changed some 25 times before the anti-abolitionists seized the opportunity to use the letter for their propaganda reasons. What I find particularly interesting about the narrative of this document and how it's been published and abused and exploited and used by from all sorts of different perspectives of this argument is, broadly speaking, it covers Nelson's attitude towards the abolition of the slave trade, and he opposed the abolition of the slave trade, but not for the reasons that the document subsequently made obvious, but in particular how Nelson, as the preeminent figure in the Navy of his period, was exploited and used and represented in that debate. And now, 200 years later, we're still in this debate, for almost with a direct link to a document that was issued in 1807. So I found it very interesting the way that document still resonates very loudly today as a key piece of evidence.
And I think that's really interesting, because I think what that is saying is, we started off with, Ray, you're talking about oral histories and how you can use those and trace them back and make inferences. Mary, making inferences from the diaries written by naval officers, and correlating those with the conditions on ship and what we know about the positions that the crewmen take. And then we've got Nelson and his writing that is also being used in different ways by different people, which just, I think, reinforces is the idea that actually history is all about perspective and different people taking different perspectives and how they can be used critically or abused. And that reminds me very much of, the quote that you started off with, Ellie, in your contribution for us earlier in the month, which was the quotation from William Laird Clues. And it was, his account of John Perkins, obviously the first Black postcard. And although the facts in terms of, where he served and when were accurate, his own racial biases crept in terms of his views towards Perkins. So I think this is really an awareness to us all that actually this is about being rigorous about using sources and using them critically and not just making the assumptions that we want to make. And I think that brings on the next question really is, how have other academic and naval researchers responded to your work? Martyn, we're talking about a document that's been used in various ways over the years and has been researched and the copy Ray. Obviously, you're looking at using oral histories and working back. Ellie, you've been working with the National Trust and re-examining things there. And Mary, obviously, you're looking at a fairly little known aspect of Royal Naval history. How are other people responding to your work? Ellie, maybe I can come to you first. Can you give me your perspective on this?
Sure. I think one thing that definitely comes out of all of this is interpretation is key, and it depends on the lens that you're looking at information from. For me, I think when I think about this sort of work, there are two audiences. Whenever it comes to Black history, it's the Black people, so that they feel empowered by highlighting the more overlooked parts. So whether it's the racism or colonialism or their part that they played. And then there's the second group, which are the sort of more conservative. They want a certain type of history to continuously be retold. And I find that sometimes that second group can react very defensively when they come across a different perspective that's being put forward. And I always encourage that if you feel a discomfort, don't go into defense or attack mode. Really sit with that discomfort and then engage with the idea and the information that you're being presented with.
And again, it's about that critical awareness of sources, isn't it? And going back to the sources. And I wonder, one of the things that I was thinking about is, Mary, I'm thinking again about the crewmen and the fact that we've got other people writing about them in their diaries, and we've got the scrimshaw, but essentially we haven't got those first person testimonies. And I wonder how much of this is, this is an issue of power in some senses. We have an obituary, for example, for Perkins, because of his status, but often we are talking about people that perhaps couldn't write or were fulfilling the lowest jobs in the hierarchy of the ship. So we haven't got their writings. And I think there's always a tension, isn't there, in history of, how do you represent those voices of the people that have less power and then therefore have less of a presence in the record?
Yes, no, definitely. I should say at the outset, I'm certainly not the first person to research the role of West African seamen on the West African coast. Ray, certainly I know you put some really interesting research in your books. I think my focus in particular is on interactions between British naval officers and the West Africans that they met and they worked with. And I think from this perspective, West African seamen, it's kind of a fascinating addition to this story, which has traditionally been very much told from kind of a glorifying role of the Royal Navy in suppressing the transatlantic slave trade. And that's not at all to say that role shouldn't be celebrated, because indeed, it starts it's like the beginning of a very long history of Royal Navy's humanitarian works. I'm not saying that at all, but that it should be told within a much wider context of Britain's role in slavery before 1807, but also in its abolition, which isn't actually just as straightforward as it's kind of been told traditionally, that there was a reliance on West Africans to do the job there, and also that kind of Britain's presence in West Africa at that time was also a lot more complex than simply being out there to stop the slave trade. There were imperial agendas that naval officers were also involved with, which had an impact on their meetings with West African rulers, for example, when they were sent out to negotiate treaties to stop the slave trade. So I think, as you were saying, it's about perspectives, and it's about putting in those different perspectives of what is taken as quite a straightforward story, but isn't actually. I mean, it's like any story in history, I guess. There's always nuances, and there's always different perspectives and different perceptions to it. So I think that's the key.
And actually, for me, that's the exciting thing about history, is that it isn't a one-sided fairy tale or horror story, but actually it's complex and it's gritty, and different people have different views, and those views change over time. So I think for audiences, there's, again, Martyn, you're talking about a document that has been, was written for private consumption, but was published fairly quickly and has been around for 200 years and is still, giving us new perspectives and new stories. So that excitement, in a sense, never ends. And I think, Ray, when we were speaking initially, you were saying everybody's interested in these stories. They speak broadly. Perhaps you'd like to say a little bit about how audiences respond to your work, Ray.
Well, to be honest, I discovered this in my role as advisor for racial equality for the Liverpool Education Authority, because when I first came into it, I had opposition like you'd never seen before from heads and staff. But as time passed, and I was lucky, I was saved. I could have been drawn from any aspect of education, but I happened to be a historian. And that saved my bacon in many ways, because some of the stories you just could not be, you could not ignore as being interesting. I found that this way I was able to bring people on board, so that by the end of when I finally retired, took early retirement, all those people, or a large section of those people who I had found to be slightly in opposition, ever so slightly in some cases, had come on board. Because what they'd done is learn something about another people they knew nothing about.
Yeah.
I always claim, this is why I write my books, I always claim that people know nothing about people of African descent. And that's a very, very strong statement. And it seems most improbable, with the long connection going right back to King Charles II and the Royal Africa Company, which were done, 300 and odd years, whatever it is. And yet people still react strangely to people of African descent, in the street even, in some parts of Britain. And there are still little pockets of Britain where they've never ever seen a black person. It's like, Christopher Columbus arriving on that first island and whatever,
Yeah. So I think there's the ability to tell stories through history. I think brings people together. It gives them experiences that, the past is a foreign land, as it were, and it enables people to have those experiences and have that deeper understanding, and an understanding of where they come from and how they're made as well. I think, I mean, the question that I need to ask you all is around the Black Lives Matter movement. Obviously, that has been a significant story for us all this year, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic. Black Lives Matter and activism around that has been a big story. And, you know, in particular for museums, we're starting with the toppling of the statue in Bristol. It has been a time for us to reflect. And obviously, very recently, Martyn, the Nelson letter has been in the news again. Do you think the Black Lives Matter movement has changed your perspective in any way? Martyn, perhaps we could start with you.
Well, I think that it has sparked, I mean, for me, all this discussion, all this debate and the letter reveals a much richer history to me than I had looked at before. I mean, I've been immersed in this stuff for 20 years. And I know how powerful and how useful artifacts and objects are in bringing stories to biography. With this particular fabricated letter, I mean, you know, I'd hate it to be used as a sort of, to be tussled over by different sides. For me, it brings just another layer of interest and evidence to an absolutely fascinating debate. One of the changes that was made to the document after Nelson's death before it was published was that Nelson in the letter said that he would wish to serve the public. And when it was published as he wished to serve the empire. And I think a lot of this material gets drawn into that later 19th century rebranding, it gets baked into a kind of imperial history. And of course, a couple of years ago, there was a suggestion that Nelson's column should be toppled. Nelson's column was raised some 40 years after Nelson's death, and it was used. He was being recruited as a logo of empire, and this document that's come to light is really the forerunner of that. So, you know, I find that all very informative of how we should see Nelson within the context of his culture, how his identity has been used, exploited by different parties and different arguments over the period since his death. And for me, it has been an incredibly enlightening process studying that document, leading me into the very fierce debates that happened 200 years ago and are happening again today, where, you know, the arguments and the debates that are happening now in the media and the press that would have been very familiar to Nelson's contemporaries in a different setting. And so it's very rewarding in that way. So, and I find, you know, so these inanimate objects and documents can really help take us into areas that, you know, people might find uncomfortable, but they nevertheless take us into their world and into their life, and we can understand them, I think, far better because of it.
Thank you. And I think that's true. And I was particularly struck when you were talking about the change in the letter from cruel to cursed and the inference around that and what that means around, you know, meaning at the time and then how it was used differently. So I think it's true to say that these debates, they don't really go away. They just change, don't they? Yes. And Ellie, you've written in particular around how you've been prompted by the Black Lives Matter movement and the lack of representation. And you're at the beginning of your career. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how the movement has changed your perspective or inspired you or galvanised you into action, perhaps?
Yeah, so for me, being new to the sex and the way that people talk about Black Lives Matter is like, for many people, it came on their radar this year. But for me, it's like over 5 years that I've really been involved with that movement, as it were. So speaking on this, but especially in a professional capacity, it's challenging, but it's also very rewarding because I'm able to bring certain perspectives that might not have been touched on. And I think that it's a really good time for people like myself who are just getting into their career who have these views to start sharing them with confidence, because they're needed. They're so needed. And I think it opens up the conversation, as people have already said, on the ways people can think differently about their connections to the past. And they might have assumed certain things about themselves, about their identity, and they get really uncomfortable about having to unpick that and challenge it. But it's really important, because we can't keep having the same debate for the next 40, 50 years. It's important to really learn the lessons that are coming out of the material, of the artifacts, so that we can then move forward.
And actually, that's wonderful, because that's sort of where I wanted to go next, really, was, you know, in particular for the NMRM context, I wonder how what our approach could be moving forward. Now, obviously, we are committed to representing a diverse audience. We are committed to telling broad stories. And we want to tell interesting stories, the stories that maybe are the little known stories, or the different perspectives and the different gems. And I just wondered, you know, in terms of your work with us this month, it's been really interesting, these different perspectives and external perspectives. But what we want to do is keep up that momentum and not stop. What's next? What could we do next? Mary, perhaps I can come to you as a long-time researcher and somebody that's used our collections. How could we move forward?
Oh, well, I'm coming at this only from the point of view of my own research. And I should just say, your collections there are amazing, and they're so rich. So it is just a case of like we've been saying, just approaching the sources in a different way, sharing and reinterpreting them. And I do think there's been, and I'm not saying this is just in the museum, but in general, this idea that the Royal Navy, if it had a role with slavery and abolition, it was only in terms of, oh, well, we suppressed the slave trade in the 19th century, so that's fine. So just to reinterpret that so that it's not that straightforward. There is a long history. The Royal Navy has a long history to do with the slave trade before 1807. You know, kind of the British naval strategy in the 18th century was very heavily focused on the West Indies, protecting the sugar industry, which was, of course, produced by enslaved labour. It defended the colonial system in the Caribbean, where many Royal Navy ships were stationed. It defended and often was part of white colonial society in the Caribbean. So I think all these different perspectives just need to be, the sources are there. There was a great source on Matthew Sheldon's blog, which showed the slave forts built by the Royal African Company along the Gold Coast. And there are plans and surveys from the mid-18th century by Royal Naval officers. So just following on from that, just taking these different stories and realising that it's just reinterpreting those collections, amplifying other voices that are found in the sources, certainly people of colour, and also people outside this kind of white male elite, like to look at all different voices from within the Royal Navy as well, and not just a case of looking at the officers. And again, that's a problem of sources, because there aren't always those sources available, but anything that can be gleaned from the collections themselves, I think that's a key thing.
Thank you, Mary. I think we could all talk ad infinitum about this really interesting subject. I think as somebody that works for the National Museum of the Royal Navy, it's been a real pleasure to work with you all over the last month, and I think it's given us food for thought. I think each of you have had a conversation with a member of the NMRM team, and that has made us think again about our collections and our sources and how we can use them and how we can work together. And what I would really like going forward is not only to look at the voices within the Royal Navy and within the sources, but actually work with more people and more partners, because actually I think that helps give us that additional perspective. So I'd like to close there, but to thank you all both for your contributions today and over the month, and potentially in the future as well as we move forward. Thank you.